Thank you. Thank you for being part of this book launch. It is a book launch. It's a book that is in the making for the past 3 years. All of you have contributed wonderful chapters and gave me new insights into it. So without any further ado, can we maybe start, and I will maybe ask, I don't have the sequence of events here in front of me, but maybe if we can ask maybe Professor Vertinsky to start us off and to talk to us about her chapter and about physical culture.
I certainly can start, Francois, if you would like. I should congratulate you for initiating and completing this project. Pretty interesting one altogether. So our part of the project responded to the reflections really of my old friend Henning Eichberg, who consistently called for a more detailed focus on the interlacement between Western histories of sport and physical culture and non-Western histories, putting particular attention to the complex political dimensions of body culture over time. We certainly miss his insights. So in the chapter I completed with my student Aishwarya Ramachandran, who's here with us today, that we call Imperial Benevolence and Emancipatory Discourses, we both set out to explore these complex interlacements with a critical look at the world of 20th century colonial expansion by tracing and critiquing evangelical footsteps in what to America were faraway places. We've so many familiar stories of muscular Christians striding into foreign parts to bestow the benefits of Western sport upon alien populations. But what Aishwarya and I wanted to ask was how and why, among so many stories of early American YMCA physical education recruits, were two that resisted, in rather different ways, the usual imperialistic physical education histories of well-trained and dedicated evangelists recreating Western sport and games programs in foreign lands to promote Christian uplift and health among the needy and the less civilized. Harry Crow Buck was one of them. He was labeled the father of Indian physical education by his Indian admirers, and he lived out almost his entire YMCA career in India, devoted to the training of physical educators and sportsmen through a kind of Deweyan philosophy of education through the physical, but remaining unusually sensitive and adaptive, really, to draw in the needy and exploit Indian interests in a good way in developing international sport and organizations. Physical educator Charles McCloy's introduction to China came through a rather different route, for he was neither a Springfield graduate nor a trained missionary. He not only followed a very different path in his work with the YMCA in China than did Buck in Madras in India, but he hewed to a rather different philosophy of what the means and ends of physical education should be and how to achieve those ends in China at a difficult and especially tempestuous moment in Chinese politics. So our project was designed to show how our reading of the exploits of these two men contributes to a rich, ever-changing literature focused on the transmission of physical cultures in colonial projects, where the racial and cultural identities of those colonized have been variously ignored or addressed in a number of ways. Each of our subjects, we discovered through a lot of scattered literature, found his own way through the colonial thicket and engaged directly and indirectly with physical education's battle of the systems. In this sense, we paid a special attention to Edward Said's understanding of culture derived from his dedication to what can be called a contrapuntal method, reading the activities of Harry Buck and Charles McCloy with an understanding of what has typically been excluded from their stories, and giving more emphasis and voice to what is silent or marginally present, rather than the popular stories available in physical education textbooks, if rendered at all. Because of empire, all cultures are involved in one another. All are hybrid, heterogeneous, differentiated, and unmonolithic. Aishwarya and I wanted to show how Buck and McCloy exemplified this hybridity through the various endeavors they undertook during the very same decades at the beginning of the 20th century, as both physical educators and muscular Christians, albeit under rather different circumstances. Activist, researcher, and scholar were all descriptors attributed to Charles McCloy's work in China during the early Chinese Republican period. Indeed, McCloy had not only learned to speak and write Mandarin, he had become a researcher and a scholar probing deeply into Chinese views on physical education at a time of physical culture, should I say, at a time of serious unrest, and unknown to his hosts, almost exclusively became known by his Chinese name, McLean. Harry Buck adhered more closely and continuously to the wide philosophy of physical education and spread by the students of Springfield College throughout the colonial world. He spent his entire career, as did his physical educator wife, focused upon the YMCA college he developed in Madras and the devoted attention he gave to the development of sporting activities in India. He died there, buried in a mausoleum at the entrance of the campus, still in harness to the institution that had trained and supported him throughout his entire career. And while Buck learned to adopt local physical culture practices in Madras as part of his emporium, McCloy industriously studied and used Mandarin in Shanghai as a way to make allies and to promote productive paths to physical fitness and health in China. He became known almost exclusively, as I said, by his Chinese name, McLean, translating and publishing physical education material from America in Mandarin into the journals he wrote and distributed. He became an institution in the world of Chinese physical education, and his readers would have found themselves in a fascinating, swirling black and white zone between China and the West. So despite having successfully assimilated themselves in vastly different local contexts, we show how, not surprisingly, the efforts and underlying values of both McCloy and Buck continued to be based on rather American ideals of health, exercise, and education. Each found his own way through the colonial thicket and engaged directly or indirectly with physical education's battle of the systems. Back home in the United States, with McCloy eventually returning from China, not really of his own volition, to set his distinctive mark upon the physical side of the argument with his famous call, "Let's have a little muscle." Yet each left a legacy, not completely sullied with colonial tropes, of only partial acquiescence with hegemonic Western formulas of modernity. They both engaged directly or indirectly with American ideals of health, exercise, and education. Yet each, in his own way, we argued anyway, set his distinctive mark upon a caring outreach to a world that remained alien to them in so very many ways. Thanks, Francois. That's our story.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. I see our moderator is back. Chris, we will take over from here. I did not introduce Professor Vertinsky. If you can maybe do that. And
yes, I will do that. Yeah. Yep, and we'll just swap the order a little bit of the speakers, okay?
Okay.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. As you know, when we need technology, it sometimes drops us. Dr. Patricia Vertrinsky is a distinguished university scholar and professor of kinesiology at the University of British Columbia. She is a social and cultural historian working across the fields of women's and gender history with a special interest in physical culture, physical education, and modern dance. She is an international fellow of the American Academy of Kinesiology, past president of the North American Society of Sport History, vice president of the International Society for Physical Education and Sports History. She has received awards from North American Society for Sport History, International Society for History of Sport and Physical Education, and a number of other organizations, and is also the recipient of an honorary PhD degree from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She has written and co-edited many books, amongst which are The Eternal Wounded Woman, Women, Exercise and Doctors in the Late 19th Century, Physical Culture, Power in the Body with Jennifer Hargreaves, Disciplining Bodies in the Gymnasium, Memory, Monument, Modernism with Sherry McKay, Sites of Sport with John Babe, and The Female Tradition in Physical Education with David Kirk. Thank you very much for your input, Professor. And I think we'll leave questions to the end, Dr. Cleophas, and keep moving. Okay, so our next speaker, and I'll introduce the person. Next person would be Dr. Malcolm Mclaren. Okay, I'll just give you a brief introduction. Dr. Malcolm Mclaren is a historian by training with degrees in anthropology, sociology, and academic affiliations to the University of Queensland, the Montfort University, and the University of Gibraltar. His research focuses on sport-related colonial, imperial, and decolonial relations, and on sport-related political activism. His current research projects explore cultural boycotts in anti-oppression political campaigns, the potentialities of sport in decolonial politics, and is a co-founder of the Netball History Network. He's also a co-founder of Philosophy at Play conference series with Wendy Russell and Emily Ryle, has co-edited several volumes of essays emerging from those events. He's a member of the editorial college of the International Journal of History of Sport and editorial boards of Sport History, Journal of Sport History, and Journal of New Zealand Pacific Studies. Over to you, Dr. Mclaren.
Thanks, Chris. I have some pictures to show, so I'm going to share a screen if I can, in my late middle age, use the technology properly. Except I can't because it's been disabled. So there we go. You'll miss my bizarre illusions. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Francois, for the invitation to be here. I've taken a rather different approach than Patricia, and I've responded to a question that Francois put to me, at least, to talk about physical culture studies with special reference to the book. So I've taken a much broader view. And it's a book that I'm delighted to be a part of and to be at this gig where we get to smash the bottle of metaphorical champagne across its cover. I couldn't reflect on physical culture without thinking about questions of positionality, and not as some kind of individual identity, but as a set of structural relations that shape and craft how we look at the world. So in exploring physical culture from the edge of empire, I'm thinking about where we think from, to pick up on ideas from scholars like Walter Mignol and Annabel Quijano and others. So in that frame, I'm a settler scholar. I'm based in the UK, but I have groundings in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I say this because all of these factors directly affect the ways I think about both empire and physical culture and what it means to be on the edge of empire. Settledness, I think, is quite important here, at least for my approaches, and it means working out new relationships with one's place. But crucially, critical settledness means doing so in a manner that not only recognises and respects the integrity and authority of those who are already in that place, but it means doing so in a way that undermines the genocidal drive of the settler colonial imperative. That's to say, to reject the drive to replace already existing indigenous peoples with the settler as the new indigene. The other factor that's relevant to my exploration today is my disciplinary background, which Chris has reflected on in some ways, and to me that's quite eclectic because of my trainings in both anthropology and sociology as well as history, and currently doing as much work in philosophy as I do in history, and in play as in sport. As a result, the where I think from is as much from an uncomfortably ambiguous cultural location as it is from an interdisciplinary academic position. My grounding in in Britain's empire of settlement and my focus on sport as a social, cultural and political practice means that my ways of thinking are framed by modernity. But decolonial interdisciplinarity takes me elsewhere. It means I see sport as a practice and product of modernity, and following recent strands in decolonial thinking, see modernity and coloniality as interwoven, as mutually sustaining phenomena. On my evil days, I see them as going as far as being codependent. The consequence that I want to reflect on today then is how sport, physical and movement cultures articulate to the coloniality of power, and for us as historians, to the coloniality of memory that underwrites that power. I do this in the context of this book, much of which asserts those subaltern memories that are delegitimated by and their associated voices that are silenced by empire. The philosopher, and here I mean the analytical philosopher in me, starts with the terms, with physical culture, as a term popularized in the late 19th century to discuss an interest in the human body as it was trained, shaped and influenced by diet and exercise. This is the physical culture that Francois draws on, for instance, in his discussions of Ron Eland and David Isaacs. It also underpins the practices that Conor Heffernan discusses in his work on Ireland, and that of Martin Clement and Jan Pejda in the way they unpick gender dynamics in the Sokol movement. Now, Jan and Martin's work in Sokol as it existed in Central Europe in the era of national self-determination, I find especially important here because it takes us to the wider question of what recent analysts have called inter-imperiality. To remind us not only that imperial relations and residues of empire exist in Europe's modern empires, but they also exist and remain from earlier imperial formations. And in this case, we're talking about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a second form of movement culture more implicit in some papers, principally because it's the dominant mode of movement and physicality, at least in organised settings. Most of us, as authors, invoke modern sport as a cultural practice, perhaps least so in the 4 chapters I've already mentioned. We see this form in Paul Hendrick's discussion of the Teachers' League of South Africa. It appears in a very different form in Taman Dekoya and Norman Ontong's discussion of the experiences of running. It's also the form of movement activity that Freda Khan is focusing on in her discussion of mountain clubs, and to a lesser extent, modern sport is emphasised in Tony Collins's concluding comments. Yet all through these subaltern voices and contested meanings run through and are articulated by those chapters. However, I want to elaborate a third approach, less obviously rooted in modernity. Physical culture for me is much more than those practices of body training and is explicitly counterposed to sport. Sport is a thing of modernity, of rationality, of discipline, of control, of measurement, and of the principles and practices associated with the 18th century's drive to control the physical world through its disenchantment, and then applied to the human body at play and in movement. As analysts such as John Bale have argued, sport's rationality means it's increasingly marked by placelessness and a desire to reduce measurement to the assessment of the human body in whole and in its various parts, without extraneous or external influences. In this sense, sport is about limitation and constraint. Physical culture takes me somewhere else. First up, my not-so-inner anthropologist gets excited about the emphasis on culture. Itself, one of those perhaps the most slippery and difficult to define of terms, although Raymond Williams did well to see it as the spirit which informed the whole way of life of a distinct people. This idea of the spirit that informs, I admit, means that I'm seeing physical culture in fairly metaphysical terms, as a whole way of movement. I see it as a consequence of the way we conceptualize the body, as a kind of ontology of the body in movement that is linked to that spirit informing a distinct people's way of life. To think then of physical culture in imperial and colonial settings with all their inequalities of power, that is to reflect on it from the edge of empire, means exploring the ways in which the cultures that meet in those imperial and colonial relations move together and apart, protecting the spaces of their way of life as a distinct people, while allowing zones where they overlap and interrelate as a kind of intercultural space. I see this in Ben Sachs' discussion of the meaning of footwear, or more importantly, of its absence. But I also see it in Patricia and Waddy's piece on the YMCA sport missionaries. And it's also what is woven through my exploration of cricket and surfing in Pacific Island or Pacific Ocean communities. In these discussions, we emphasise those intercultural spaces as spaces of contested cultural adaptation. We're far from alone in this approach, and I just know that in major works in the last year, Wade Davies brings this approach to bear in his history of Native American basketball, as does Janice Forsyth, who's in the room. Hi, Janice. In her discussion of Indigenous self-determination and sporting practices in the lands we call Canada. And I'm not sure if whether Ben Sachs is here, but I'd also say the same about his fantastic book about Samoan cricket from a couple of years ago. The fuzziness of this intercultural space then opens up opportunities for nuanced and subtle explorations of movement and of bodies at play, by stepping around the formal constraints of sport to dive into what lies below or behind, or as Irving Goffman would have said, to go backstage. The dynamics of imperial power mean that we can't evade sport and physical culture's links to the processes of racialization that underpin modernity's empires, while the disruption of analytical boundaries and binaries opens up uncomfortable questions of complicity in that racialization. This is the consequence of rejecting the binary logic of adoption or rejection and focusing on the messiness of lived experience. To explore physical culture in a colonial and imperial setting means considering the spirit that lies within those bodies in movement. Doing so means engaging with those ontological elements we can get access to by going backstage. But doing so also disrupts our understandings of sport by admitting other meanings that challenge its basis in modernity. This is a real challenge for many of us whose worldview is rooted in the philosophies developed in Euro-American modernity. To give an example, the meeting of body cultures in colonial Aotearoa underpins some key parts of some work that I'm currently doing in respect of more contemporary Indigenous engagements with rugby. But it means grappling with several challenging philosophical issues, including, for instance, that in Tao Māori, in the Māori world, time and space are unified, meaning that in the words of the philosopher Georgina Tuori Stewart, ancestors can collapse the space-time continuum to be co-present with their descendants. And note that the agency lies here with ancestors. I'm not ashamed to say that the implications of this different understanding of space and time are beyond me in this particular context, while noting that it also suggests that the view that Māori adopted rugby on settler terms lacks phenomenological insight. This is also in the same spirit as John Bale's exploration of the Rwandan practice of Gusambuka as not being the high jumping that colonial observers and scientists reduced it to through its sportisation. So to wrap up, what does this anthropological sense of physical culture offer? With some apologies for leaping over some things I haven't had the chance to develop well, I start from the assumption that sport is the product of modernity, and as such in imperial and colonial settings, it's also an agent of modernity's denial of the humanization of colonial subaltern in a colonial matrix of power. Given this presumption, I focus on I focus on physical culture, as outlined here, decenters sport as the, and I stress the use of the definite article there, as the systematically validated form of body and movement culture. But also physical culture allows us to decenter coloniality's monopoly on the power to define. This decentering then grants legitimacy to the resistance essential to Indigenous adaptation of colonial practices and movement cultures. As a consequence, historians and other scholars get better access to subaltern encounter memories that challenge the coloniality of memory that itself sustains the colonial matrix of power. That is to say, this notion of physical culture encourages us to think otherwise. And I hear the historian in me and historians in the room screaming about counterfactuals, but remember, this is about where we think from. And in thinking otherwise, perhaps even to think the unthinkable. In other words, by allowing us to go backstage, we think from elsewhere. Now, noting that in sports studies, these are relatively new questions, I might have got this all wrong. But also the essays in this book, whatever their approach to physical culture, gives us material that will help us get it better. So if I have got it wrong, it's in the spirit of Samuel Beckett's observation to try again, and fail better. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that input. I'll go right on to the next speaker, and that would be Professor Bruce Kidd. Just give me a second to read from his bio note. And Bruce Kidd is Director of the University of Toronto, as well as the Dean of and a Professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. He is a Canadian academic, author, and athlete. He was born in Ottawa, Ontario. He was a member of the University of Toronto track and field team. And then there's a long list of sport achievement, which include 18 national senior championships in Canada, medals at the 1962 British Empire and Commonwealth Games, and he was also a member of the Canadian 1964 Summer Olympic team, competing in the men's 5,000 and 10,000 meters. And he was scheduled to start in the men's marathon. In 1970, he joined the University of Toronto as a lecturer. He was appointed as assistant professor in 1973, an associate professor in 1979. In 1991, he was appointed a professor. He's a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Physical Education, and the warden of Art House, the University of Toronto. He's an honorary member of the Canadian Olympic Committee and voluntary chair of the Selection Committee, Canada's Sports Hall of Fame. So I'll hand over to Professor Kidd.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that unnecessarily long but very gracious introduction. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and I congratulate Francois and all the contributors for their contributions to this incredible book. I learned a lot from it and a lot to think about it. My brief remarks will be a reminiscence and reflection about my late friend Ron Eland, who is the subject of the opening chapter. I think of Ron every time I drive by his church, the Fairbank Presbyterian Church that is around the corner from me. So when I'm caught in a traffic jam, it's usually in front of his church, and I have a moment to reflect on Ron. I only got to know him in the 1980s after he'd already lived 60 years. He'd already had at least one heart attack and several other health challenges. But even then, I knew him as a force of nature, just a powerful teacher, leader, and of course, incredible advocate of a healthy body in a deliberate mind. I love the quote from one of the clubs that he was a member of, "Sacred thy body as thy soul." Ron, all his life, expressed that view and tried to infuse others with it. He was a weightlifter, he was a bodybuilder, he was a teacher, and to the end of his days, that's what he was dedicated to. After he retired from formal teaching in the public school board, he took on part-time coaching in two community clubs not far from us in Toronto, the JCC, or the Jewish Community Center, and the Columbus Center, which was a cultural center for Italian immigrants. There was no culture to which Ron was unfamiliar, and to which he was not prepared to take his mission of embodied health and well-being in every human. In the early 1990s, along with Sam Ramsamy, of what became the South African National Olympic Committee, I helped Ron return to South Africa and also Zimbabwe to give a series of clinics on bodybuilding and weightlifting after apartheid had come down, and during a time when the beginnings of the movement that we now know as Sport for Development and Peace was underway. And he was one of the, by then he was in his 70s, and he was still prepared to give something back, as he talked about it, as a leader in physical culture in the communities that had been oppressed on the one hand, and the frontline state of Zimbabwe beaten up so badly by the South African Defense Force and the economic policies of the apartheid regime. Ron's story is an incredible story. I hope, Francois, that you can find someone to turn your chapter into a film script. And we have a feature film on Ron that could be shown around the world. It's, and certainly within Africa, of an exemplary, lifelong champion of physical culture and sport. He was almost self-taught. He began the discipline of weightlifting with homemade equipment. He continued to persevere despite discrimination and other hardship. When he was denied a place on the South African Olympic team in 1948, he found a way to take the boat to London and win a place on the British team, which was then possible, and competed in those Olympics, while in other side competitions, winning medals and other major championships. He went back to South Africa, worked in schools while subverting apartheid in sport as much as he could, until he decided that that it was becoming harder and harder to do that. And he went to the United States for 4 years, and there's a horrifying 4-year part of his life when he's living on nothing, eking out a livelihood in woefully underpaid hourly jobs, trying to support his family back in South Africa and trying to find his way. And then he came to Canada, where he picked up his, he came to Canada in his 50s. He picked up 2 more degrees to enable him to get teaching certificates in the Canadian system, and had a career as a teacher in our public school system until, it's such an incredible story of determination, persistence against incredible odds. And all of this time he continued to lift. He continued to perform in body presentations, in bodybuilding competitions, in circuses, and to keep himself fit in order to do that. It would be a very traditional, affirming biography, but there are so many complications along the way. There's so many hardships that he overcame. It would be such an inspiring story. The other part of his story, which Francois, you've not given as much attention to, is the support that he enjoyed and the network of comrades that he benefited from and contributed to across all of the racial, cultural, political, religious organizational divides that enabled him to do that. One of the things that I found so moving and fascinating about your account is the extent to which at every stage of his career, through his own outreach and personality, but through the generosity of others, he had people who helped him circumvent apartheid or overcome their rejection or find a place on another team or find a place to live or find a competition where he could excel. And most of those links were forged by sport and just the love of sport. I mean, thinking for a Black South African to go to England in 1948, when there was so much racism against Black immigrants or visitors from all over the British Empire, and yet he found sponsors who were enable him to find a place on that British team. When he went to the United States, one of the things that kept him going was the network of bodybuilding and weightlifting clubs that somehow he connected to that gave him support. When he came to Canada, where the sport was not very well developed at all, through this international network of weightlifting and bodybuilding clubs, he was able to find his feet. He was able to obtain honorary positions. I mean, he always told me these stories, and I still remark on them because 2 years after he arrived in Canada, he was recruited to be an Olympic coach for the Canadian team in Montreal. And 2 years after that, the Commonwealth team in Edmonton. An unheard of acceptance, given the barriers to the inclusion of immigrants and refugees generally in Canada. But because of this particular sport culture, he was welcomed with open arms and given support. I don't have the answer to the question that I raise about that's not always the culture of sport. Is that the culture of bodybuilding? Is that the culture of weightlifting? And what is it about that sport that has been, that in Ron's case and Precious McKenzie's case, another example that you cite, who had even more of a welcome across the English-speaking countries that enabled that to happen. In my experience, weightlifting, bodybuilding has always been a marginal, really almost a culture of protest. It is so outside the official, the official sports, and yet it's got such a fierce spirit of engagement. Is it because these men were beating the colonizers at their own game, learning their lifts and raising more than their white competitors? What is it about these links? I just do not know. But there is.
5 minutes.
Okay, I can wind up very, very quickly. In addition to this extraordinary biography which you tell, there's this amazing story of how, against the worst odds, this extremely strong man nevertheless took advantage of a worldwide network of people also committed to this tradition of sacred bodies and sacred souls to support each other under horrible conditions to live full lives. It's not only a celebration, a commemoration of individual resistance against the colonial inequalities and oppressions that are well documented, but it's a support. It's a story of these networks. When I think of my own experiences in the global South in sport, I think there are many other examples of these people and these cultures that we could tell. I hope that your book inspires others to dig up these stories and tell them, because they're such an important part of what we call international sport. Again, my heartiest congratulations to all of you for such an amazing collection.
Thank you very much, Professor Kidd. We'll move on to our next speaker, Professor Tony Collins. I'll just give you a brief introduction. Tony Collins is a British social historian specializing in history of sport. He is an emeritus professor of history at De Montfort University, a research fellow at the Institute of Sports Humanities, and in 2018 was a visiting professor at the Beijing Sports University. He's the author of numerous books and articles on the history of sport, including How Football Began, 2018, The Oval World, A Global History of Rugby, 2015, and Sport in a Capitalist Society, 2013. Over to you, Professor Collins.
Thanks very much, Chris. And thank you, especially Francois, for inviting me. It's a privilege to be to speak at this event. And I think, as the contributors before me have really highlighted, I think this is a very important book. I think each chapter is very insightful and thought-provoking, and I think it will go somewhere to setting an agenda for scholars going forward who are studying physical culture, sport, and all that encompasses. So I'm going to take a bit more of a macro view, I guess you could say, and look at physical culture through through its position in, if you like, the imperialist network of the 19th century. And I think it's true to say that modern physical culture and sport is a product of the age of imperialism in the late 19th century. And in particular, it's a creation of the British imperial and colonialist project. And I think this book, each of its chapters, is an important contribution to our understanding of the relationship between physical culture, imperialism, and what that means at the individual and group level. I think that the connection between imperialism and physical culture was widely understood in the 19th century, and it was promoted by sports administrators and journalists. They believed that it was a vital element of the culture that held the British Empire together. So, for example, the St. James's Gazette, a popular weekly newspaper in London in the late 19th century, said, "Strong is the bond of nationality, strong are the ties of commerce, but even stronger is the union of heart, which comes from devotion to the same forms of physical recreation." And of course, is anyone familiar with Sir Henry Newbolt's Vita Lampada, play up and play the game if you don't know it, will realise the link between sport and imperial militarism was fundamental. The delegates at the founding conference of the Football Association in 1863 included 5 army officers, a future assistant under-secretary of state for war, and representatives of the War Office and the Royal Naval Schools, and the clubs of the Royal Naval Schools. Sporting organisations across the British Empire shared similarly close ties to the military. Lord Harris was an England cricket captain and MCC president, and was perhaps better known as the governor of Bombay between 1890 and 1895. And the fact, perhaps most shockingly, the fact that many British sports prizes or bets were measured in guineas, coins which were originally minted with gold supplied by the slave traders of the Royal African Company and named after the West African region where millions of Africans were captured and enslaved, underlies the close link between sport, physical culture, and the imperial slave trade. The ideological underpinnings of that culture was built on what I think is a British nationalist ideology of muscular Christianity, which was perhaps best expressed in the 1857 novel Tom Brown's School Days. This was a bestseller throughout the English-speaking world, and it not only promoted the importance of sport and physical culture, particularly cricket and rugby football, but it also popularised muscular Christianity's belief in the superiority of the British race, its disdain of non-British races, and the strict division of the sexes in order to protect young men from the supposed dangers of femininity and homosexuality. The moral and cultural meanings invested in physical culture by the British middle classes in the 19th century provided an ethical framework through which an imperial British value system could be disseminated around the globe. Tom Brown's School Days itself became something of a handbook of the values of physical culture as they spread around the globe. And these became a means by which English-speaking colonial settlers sought to reassure themselves of the superiority of their way of life, and later, as they sought to inculcate those values, inculcate those values amongst the conquered colonial elites. Through sport and physical culture, imperialism demanded the refashioning and discipline of the human body. In the metropolitan centres, working class bodies were developed according to the needs of the capitalist factory. Physical strength was essential for males involved in manual labour, whilst dexterous labour was demanded of women in textile factories. In the colonialised countries, stamina and endurance was essential for the arduous labour needed to generate the super profits of imperialism. In the British Empire, it was always believed that trade followed the flag. We can also say with confidence that a man with a bow was not far behind that trade and that flag. The first record of cricket being played in India is by sailors working for the East India Company, who organised an impromptu match in 1721 in the Gujarat. In 1908, two teams of British Army officers played each other in South Africa, probably the first cricket match to be held in South Africa. Where a score or so of our sons are found, observed Anthony Trollope in 1868, there is found cricket. These early cricket clubs became part of the social networks of the white colonial settler administrators, and settlers, a source of both physical recreation and reassurance of their Britishness. But it was the growth of the imperialist rivalries in the second half of the 19th century, the so-called age of the scramble for Africa, and the international tensions that would eventually lead to World War I, that stimulated the creation of an imperial physical culture network. Cricket tours to and from England, Australia, and South Africa were well established by 1900. In 1888, the first rugby tour to Australia and New Zealand took place, followed in 1891 by a visit by the British to South Africa. By the end of the 19th century, sporting tours between the major colonies were part of the daily cultural life of the British Empire. As in Britain, physical culture became an essential part of the imperial education system. Schools like Melbourne's Grammar School, Cape Town's Diocesan College, and New Zealand's Nelson College were all founded within a decade of each other and were central to the development of physical culture in their respective countries, thanks to headmasters who placed it at the core of the curriculum. Education was also the artery through which British physical culture was transmitted to colonial people subjugated by the British Empire, and especially to their local elites. British-inspired schools to educate the sons of Indian princes were founded in the decades after the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857. The uprising shocked the British rulers and educational reforms were begun, leading to the formation of schools based on muscular Christianity. Chief among those was Raj Kumar College, opened in 1868, which was clear in its purpose. We shall discipline their bodies in the manliness and hardihood of the English public schoolboy, its manifesto said. Tom Brown's School Days was read personally to the boys by the headmaster. The school also produced two of India's greatest cricketers, the Princes Ranjit Singh and Duleep Singh, both of whom play for England rather than India, a telling indication of the relationship between cricket and empire at this time. This same pattern was to be found wherever the British sought to maintain their rule through local elites. In Ghana, Achimota College was founded in 1927 and boasted 2 cricket ovals, 4 football fields, 3 hockey pitches, plus fields for netball and for rounders. In Trinidad, Queen's Royal College, situated on a square originally called Billiards Orchard, educated future local administrators and sportsmen, not least C.L.R. James, the future revolutionary and author of the classics The Black Jacobins and Beyond a Boundary. In Beyond a Boundary, James sought to demonstrate that on the supposedly level playing field of cricket, all players started as equals regardless of colour, class or caste. Growing up in a racially stratified society of colonial Trinidad, James described how social and political passions denied normal outlets expressed themselves so fiercely in cricket, precisely because they were games. However, I think it's more complicated than that. The idea that physical culture and sport provided a level field on which merit alone can triumph, regardless of class or colour, was an extension of the muscular Christian notion of fair play, but it ignored the question of who controlled access to physical culture. The first decades of colonial cricket in India were dominated by those educated at elite schools. In the West Indies, access to education, therefore sports, was open only to the rich or those like James himself, who were able to win scholarships to elite schools. The ideology of amateurism also allowed the middle-class administrators of sport to determine who should be allowed to play according to an arbitrary definition of who was an amateur, creating a powerful ideology of social exclusion. And of course, the most fundamental division in physical culture was and remains that between men and women, in which women were excluded from so-called male sports and physical activities. These divisions of class, race, and gender were present at the very birth of modern physical culture and were carried with it wherever it spread across the world. To sum up, physical culture and sport were one of the most important and far-reaching projects of the age of imperialism. Yet the right to play and participate in physical culture, regardless of status or origins, was also a crucially important struggle. As Taminda Kaur and Norman Ontong explain in their chapter on the Fit to Run Race of Life in the book, the race's social history is also a political history of South African athletics, exposing the limits of transformation. And I think this can be also said of many other sports. Just as in the colonial era, physical culture today reflects and reinforces the ideology of the society that gave birth to it and sustains it. And the struggle for equality and full participation in physical culture will only be won when the right to fully participate in society is won for everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your input there, Tony. I think we're going to hand over to Dr. Fish, who will now introduce Dr. Francois Cleophas, the editor of the collection or anthology. Dr. Fish is in the faculty in which he works. She is the Vice Dean, Clinical Services and Social Impact. And a big part of her work is working with the Western Cape Health Department to optimize the relationship between the university for academic purposes. Over to you, Dr. Fish.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you can, but you don't see.
You can see me now? Okay. Colleagues, thank you. I thought I was going to do the introduction at the beginning, but it's been very helpful also just to listen to the other contributors and the other speakers. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Francois Cleophas. And so Dr. Cleophas was born and bred in the southern suburbs and attended the Heathfield Primary and the Wynberg Secondary School. And the latter, the Wynberg Secondary School, was in fact a stone's throw away from where I grew up in Wynberg. So he was schooled during the era of apartheid, when the policy of separate education was really based on the race of the populations of South Africa. He relates in an email to me the difficulty of being an Afrikaans-speaking child in an English-speaking primary school, where I quote, Afrikaans-speaking, not Afrikaans in the sense of Afrikaner, but Afrikaans in the sense of Adam Small type Afrikaans, in an environment where teachers and the principal degraded Afrikaans identities that were associated with the working class culture. During his time at the Wynberg Senior Secondary School, he was exposed to the landscape of non-racial sport, school sport. And at that time, sports structures such as SACOS, where slogans such as no normal sport in an abnormal society were active in many communities. Such organizations lobbied for South Africa's expulsion from world sport. As a young man, he excelled in sport during the period of 1982 to 1986 and obtained his provincial colors in athletics and held the 400 meters junior national record of 48.6 seconds. If Dr. Cleophas, like many others, had been born in a free and democratic country, his life course may have been very different. He went on to obtain a BA in physical education in 1987 with a higher diploma in education a year later. He continued his educational journey with a BA honors in human movements studies, an MPhil in 1993 in education psychology, and his PhD in sport history. His two theses at the master's and the doctoral level speaks to his continued interest in sport and its history. He went back to the high school, to his high school as a teacher, and I'm sure continued to influence many a young man, both on and off the sports field during the period of 1989 to 2002. It was during this time that the country held its first democratic elections in 1994. He went on to teach another very prominent school in the southern suburbs, South Peninsula High, a so-called colored school that produced many individuals who went on to excel in their chosen careers, both in South Africa and beyond. He joined our university in 2011 in the Department of Sports Science, and he's recognized for his research area of cultural histories. He publishes in both national and international journals and has 37 publications in accredited journals and has authored 9 books. He's a prolific writer, as evidenced by his writings in many non-accredited journals and in many newspaper columns and articles. He continues to present his work on various conferences and being invited as a guest speaker in a number of different settings. So we're very privileged to participate in the launch of his second book today. And I think I'm reading from the end of the introduction to the book that he's well qualified in writing and commenting on the field of sport history. We look forward to his input. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fish. Dr. Cleophas.
Thank you. Thank you. To be honest, I think all the speakers summed up what is the content of the book. After going through all these chapters, the conclusion that I've come to is that the body is not outside of history. The body is not outside of politics. The body is not separate from the testing and the kind of measurements that we do. The body is historical, the body is political, the body is also scientific, and we humans, we make them these things. And we should start a discourse, I'm talking about myself now, on how we make the body political. Bruce mentioned the kind of links which somebody had that helped him to shape the kind of sports person that he was. Those political links are also controversial links. Ron Elan, for example, had links with people across the cultural divides, but also with links with people who were not always strongly, fiercely in opposition to apartheid. So we need to dig deeper into how the body is made political. So I teach a module in my department that is called Program Development. And I found myself still teaching an embedded form of didactics. I'm still finding myself at times using a kind of language of science that is neutral from politics and society. And I think after engaging with the text in this book, I found a kind of language where I can talk about the body politics in local spaces, the body politics in the environment, in the Anthropocene, the body politics in personal histories, the body politics in nationalisms. So this publication is the start of giving me personally, and I hope for some more scholars, a kind of language that I can engage with my students with to start pedagogy. It's a pedagogy that will hopefully unfetter the body that is trapped at the moment in measurement and testing by instruments that is made in a new liberal economic system. Students of sports science, not only where I am, but throughout the world, they found themselves in a system where they are testing and they are busy measuring bodies through big data systems that is very often so complicated that there's sometimes no divide anymore between observation and surveillance. So those are the thoughts that I'm going to take with me from this book and going forward. So at this point, I just want to maybe introduce one of my students, Ms. Apollos, just to read the acknowledgements and the thank you that I want to give to various people.
Thank you, Dr. Cleophas. I will just share my screen quickly. This publication is the outcome of an ongoing research interest in physical culture studies that was kickstarted many years ago. My first contact with physical culture was with Mona, my mother on the cover page, and Ronnie, my father pictured here. I will forever be indebted to you both for that. My interest in an alternative physical education program was sparked by lectures on a critique of fundamental pedagogics and Christian national education by Winston Cloppers in 1990, and the sociological frameworks of functionalism, conflict theories, and figurationalism by Denver Hendricks in 1987 at the University of the Western Cape. I will never forget those lectures, and it still provides my foundational analysis for physical education and physical culture. I also wish to express my gratitude towards Professor Floris van der Merwe, my PhD supervisor, for his guidance during my initial exploration of physical culture. I acknowledge the Harriet Tom Bursary Committee for providing funding for a research visit to the H.J. Lutcher Stark Center for Physical Culture and Sports at University of Texas at Austin and the Eland family in Canada in 2017. The center unselfishly opened their archives and allowed me access to materials I otherwise would not have been able to obtain in South Africa. A special thank you to Janice and Terry Todd for your hospitality. I will always be extremely thankful for the very generous and kind manner in which Cindy Slater accessed, photocopied, and scanned hundreds of articles and clippings for me, some of which appears in this publication. The chapter on Ron Eland would not have been possible without the Eland family entrusting me with Ron Eland's archive. Thank you for letting me into this space. I hope the chapter does justice to his legacy. My visit to Canada was rounded off by the hospitality of former South Africans, family, friends, and new acquaintances. Thank you to all who shared your stories with me. A special thank you to Lillian and Joe and family for going out of your way to make my stay as comfortable as possible. Thank you to Uncle Tony and Aunt Anne Feeder for accommodating me and facilitating direct telephonic access to Precious Mackenzie through your contacts. Thank you also Uncle Aby and Aunt Nelly, Bonnie and Patricia and families for your hospitality and driving me around. You are gone from home because of apartheid. I continue to fight the vestiges of that system. I love you always. In no small way do I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Hendrik Snyders for ideas around this publication. My political consciousness is shaped by the traditions of non-racialism and the movements associated with it. Some of these movements are mentioned in this volume. I remain grateful for the ideas these movements advocated in the past. It remains relevant today. A special word of appreciation to Dr. Paul Hendricks and Brian Isaacs, who set examples of what it means to let us live for our children. It will not be enough to only say thank you to Michelle Heswick for supporting and motivating me to continue with what I enjoy doing, researching physical culture history. Finally, I thank all the contributors to this publication for both your patience during the process, as well as your sustained effort over the years in promoting physical culture. I have worked with many of you. I met some of you through conferences or your writings, and I share the same interest as you. Physical culture at the edges of empire. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paulus. Dr. Cleophas and the Sun Media people, I think we have come to the end of our program for today.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Let me then just take this opportunity. Yes? I don't see any questions in the chat box. Oh, sorry, Vikas is going to say something?
Yes, I think because
there is a question in the Q&A box from Darlene Kluka.
Where is that? Okay. Is it further up? Can Darlene not verbalize her question?
The question is, appreciate the information about the book. How can we in sports sciences use this information to deepen the contribution to where we are going in the future?
Was that directed at the author, the editor?
I think Dr. Cleophas can respond.
Yep. You're muted. Francois, unmute.
Sorry, Tony, I don't know if you maybe want to jump in perhaps, because you did allude to something like that. Tony, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot, Francois. Yeah. It's your privilege, I guess. I think that's a really interesting question because I think, well, as you just said, Francois, one of the things that's happening in sport is the use of big data to enable sports coaches and sports teams to hone the performance of athletes to an even greater extent than before. Personally, I think that one of the dangers that is that I think is obviously inherent in that is the fact that sport ceases to become anything approaching enjoyment and becomes essentially a source of labor, and that athletes are measured and sorry, I thought my Wi-Fi was dropping out. The athletes are measured and trained in a way that perhaps could be seen as equivalent to the way in which employees at somewhere like Amazon are controlled and trained, in that every single waking moment is, every single moment on the job anyway, is is measured, and there's a specific output that's expected from that. And I think that's one of the dangers that exists now with training regimes, that athletes are simply reduced to physical machines with the goal of winning medals, championships, cups, and trophies. So I do think that there is an issue within sport today in which athletes are being controlled in ways that were previously thought of as impossible and are not desirable. And I'd also say, perhaps more controversially, I think that a lot of the disciplinary measures that are used in drug testing are also part of that process, whereby the individuality and the civil rights of athletes are often removed, potentially from the best of reasons, but nevertheless, I think it's there are worrying signs in professional athletics and professional sport about the way that athletes are now being treated.
Like a return to the movie Metropolis.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah.
Okay. Any other comments from the panel? Yes, go ahead, Malcolm.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Darlene. It's the classic question in a sense of so what that I think we need to all reflect on at various times. I think one of the ways to directly answer the question lies in Francois' comments in his talk about the pedagogical potential of opening up other ways of thinking. And other languages that may be associated not just with sport but with forms of movement in general. And so I think there's an important thing that runs through quite a number of the chapters that could grant our students access to those different ways of seeing and different ways of being in sport. And I say that utterly agreeing with Tony's comments about the dangers of measurement, and not just the dangers of measurement of the body as a whole, but the destruction of the body as a site of measurement as well, so that very small parts of it are being assessed. Which leads me to the second pedagogical tool, as much as the one around language as the one around how experience of physical culture, how experience of movement and sport is being talked about and understood and played out. What I think a number of these papers do is that they allow our students ways into seeing and thinking differently, because it takes us outside for many of us, the very North Atlantic ways of thinking and being and experiencing those practices. I'm not necessarily sure that we wrote these with that in mind, but that it's certainly an element that comes through quite a few of them.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a short comment from panel members as a parting shot.
Yes, if I can maybe say something.
Francois.
I think to link in with what Malcolm and what Tony has said, one thing what this book, on what the chapters when I was going through it brought home again, that sport is linked to the environment in very materialistic ways. I think it was Holly Thorpe's book that came out now recently on the body and physical culture. The issue of gold, for example, Olympic athletes all strive after the Olympic gold medal that is mined in the gold mines by workers who are very often not paid a decent salary. the environment, the economy, the political, the social, languages, sport, all are interlinked. They are not separate beings.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Maybe
Paul,
you done? You want to continue, Francois?
no, I'm done. Thank you. I think Paul
Okay.
posed a question in the chat box.
I didn't find anything in the chat box. Let me go to the Q&A. There was only Darlene's question. Vickers, did you pick up something in the chat box?
Yes, there is a question. To what degree does physical culture provide fresh possibilities for seriously challenging power relations and inequalities within society, or is it too hemmed in by political, social, and economic forces, and thus largely complicitous in reproducing present-day social relations? That's a question by Paul Hendricks.
Well, we've talked about this as long as I can remember. And there have been times when the most visible forms of sport have rigidly supported the hierarchy and the most oppressive military, economic, and political constraints. The best example for me is always the military flyover at the halftime show of the Super Bowl in the American Football Championship of the capitalist cartel called the National Football League. So that you've got this sport game, reinforcing the hegemonic power of the United States. But there have also been many moments of subversion, resistance, combating that. And I think we're seeing a period now where, led by professional Olympic athletes, women as well as men, in many parts of the world, some of those historic relationships are being called. In the United States, which is a country to the south of where I live, Major League Baseball, this huge corporation, has agreed to move one of its showcase spectacles, the All-Star Game, out of Georgia to protest a new law which is restricting access to voting in a really racist way. So it's once again a really interesting period where some of these relationships are being contested. I'm sure other panelists can add to this. It is one of the most important questions we always have to deal with, and especially interesting now.
Okay, any other inputs?
I particularly like that part where Tony mentioned that how often we are stunted and we are not able to see beyond such mythical notions such as sport unites all. Because sport does more than that also. Sport doesn't only unite us, sport is also the cause of many fissures in society. Tony, I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I agree with both you, Francois, and what Bruce said. That I think that sport, to be frank, I think sport with its binary win-lose system, that's competition at the heart of it, it does reproduce the norms of the society, the capitalist societies that we live in. However, having said that, the right to play and enjoy oneself is one of the most fundamental of all human needs and enjoyments. And so there will always be a contradiction at the heart of sport between people's desire to play whatever sport they choose, however they choose, with whomever they choose, and that that underlying structure of sport. And so at various points, as Bruce said, today, to some extent, that breaks out. Perhaps the most famous example in the 1960s with Muhammad Ali's refusal to go to Vietnam and Tommy Smith and John Carlos's most famous protests. At that point, sport, which for a long time before that would have been seen as a fundamentally conservative force in society, suddenly broke out and became an arena for incredibly important struggles. So I think that, sport does reproduce the power relations, but there's also the fact that people want to reject those power relations and play the sport of their choice. And I think that means that sport can play a role, or at least perhaps not sport itself, but people's struggles within sport, struggles of athletes, of supporters, of those who are committed to sports, will play a role. Because ultimately, I think that what perhaps is one of the great myths of sport, that it's a level playing field in which everybody can compete on equal terms. That myth is probably its Achilles heel, because people want that to happen and want that to occur and want sport to be a place where people can meet on equal terms.
And Tony, if I can add to that, colleagues, it's been the liberal, the contradictions in the liberal promise of the level playing field, and the inclusion of all, that is produced the friction that has led to a lot of change. I think most of the equity battles have called the sports establishment and the social establishment on the rhetoric, and use that to argue for inclusion. And I think that will be a continued strategy.
Because they show how the body can find its way out of this trapped system. And sport does it over and over again. So every time we see the body trapped again in another labyrinth of systems, sport opens up the doors and helps us out.
Colleagues, thank you very much.
Can I just come in here with a quick wrap up on this, Chris? Firstly, Bruce, I really like the comment that you made about Major League Baseball there, and the thing that I'd add to it is that the only reason Major League Baseball moved was because of the political pressure on it to do so. It's never acted in a progressive manner, in a voluntary way. It's only responded to mass campaigns and mass political pressure to do so, and that's the other dynamic there, where we're looking at these institutions and organisations of sport, and how the kinds of changes that Paul's alluding to here might take place. It's because of the social movements that happen around them and influence them, rather than necessarily it's the institutions of industrial sport acting on its own terms. The second thing that I just want to note here in response to Paul's question is that so far we have been talking about the institutions of industrial sport in many sense, rather than necessarily the quotidian day-to-day play in the street. And it's those kinds of places that subversive potential can come out in very important ways that we as historians in particular haven't looked at well, that we haven't explored those banal ways in which play takes place.
Which Henning Eichberg showed us so very clearly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Henning's work is really important there. Just as a quick illustration, when I was talking, I mentioned Wade Davis's book on histories of Native American basketball, and one of the points that he makes there is that inside the trauma of the Indian schools, where a large number of young Indigenous people were forced in the late 19th through to the latter parts of the 20th century, there was a way in which basketball in particular took on a self-organized form in many places, and that alongside its attempt to control and discipline, these young players found gaps in the system to stake their own claim as well. And that's the other thing I think it's really important for us to look at. And I think that Patricia, you alluded to that in a sense as well. The way in which those structural gaps allow that independent action, those sporting forms to take on things other than what the industry intends that they mean. It's looking in those kinds of things and those kinds of places that the social relations can be subverted.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all the insightful and valuable inputs from the panel. Again, congratulations to Francois, whose work has always been involved with lifting out the hidden stories that challenge the grand narratives. So thank you, Francois, for foregrounding that and for opening up the debates like we've seen here today. You know, it goes way beyond the mere, let me call it, written word, but the deeper nuanced meanings and expression that is read in the stories, especially by the panel today. Thank you very much to all the panel members. Thank you everyone for attending. And thank you to Sun Media for hosting this important launch today. Thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the weekend. We're all at different time frames, I think. Well done, Francois, and thank you everyone else for your input on the panels.